If you are not familiar with Jillian Michaels was one of the trainers on a show called The Biggest Loser, which I actually used to watch. I thought it was a pretty interesting show. There's a documentary about it right now on Netflix. I feel a little bit differently now that I know what went on behind the scenes. So it's interesting. Jillian Michaels has been focusing more on politics. So yes, she's known as like a fitness guru, but now she's focusing more on politics. And I don't know, maybe she needs to go back to just focusing on the fitness. So she has a political podcast that she has, and she was recently on CNN, a panel on Abby Phillips' show. And she made a comment that has made the shock around the world. Let's get into it, folks. So this is Jillian Michaels here in the white blazer. Here we go.
Have you looked at some of the things that are being reviewed?
Yeah, slavery was a bad thing that was to talk about.
Okay.
Like, he forgives
He's not whitewashing slavery.
So he's not?
He's not. No,
okay.
He's not. And you cannot tie imperialism and racism and slavery to just one race, which is pretty much what every single exhibit does. But let's talk about the fact that when you look at slavery, let's talk about the fact.
I mean, slavery in America was.
Do you realize that only less than 2% of white Americans owned slaves?
But it was a system of white supremacy.
You realize that slavery is thousands of years old?
White people were.
Do you know who was the first race to try to end slavery?
Well,
what's controversial?
I'm very surprised.
This is an extraordinary exercise in historical revisionism.
I'm really surprised.
Do you realize that,
Jillian, I'm surprised that you're trying to litigate who was the beneficiary of slavery and who was not.
What I'm trying to tell you is that
in the context of American history, in the context of American history, what are you saying is incorrect by saying that it was white people oppressing black people?
Every single thing is like, oh, no, this is all because white people bad. And that's just not the truth. Like, for example, every single exhibit, I have a list of every single one. Like, people migrated from Cuba because white people bad, not because of Castro. Yes, no, it's in there. That's what I'm saying. You don't actually know what's in there. Do you know that when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the gay flag?
So first of all, okay, let's walk through this. So basically what they were talking about was Donald Trump and his take or some of the actions that he may want to pursue with the museums, which I've covered on the show before. I've been to the African American History Museum in DC. I thought they did an amazing job. It's a lot of information. It's a lot to see. And that is one of the ones that is targeted, not the only one. The Native American Museum in DC as well is on his radar. And I told you guys before, what are they actually trying to hide? Like, history is history, right? So if we're going to talk about history, we need to talk about all of it and not just the part that makes you feel warm and fuzzy in the inside, right? So listen to this one more time, because there's so many different ways that Jillian Michaels could have taken this conversation. She decided not to. She really decided to go there. Listen one more time.
Have you looked at some of the things that are being reviewed?
Yeah, slavery was a bad thing that was to talk about.
Okay.
Like, he forgives
He's not whitewashing slavery.
So he's not?
He's not. No,
okay.
He's not. And you cannot tie imperialism and racism and slavery to just one race, which is pretty much what every single exhibit does. But let's talk about the fact.
Pause. Who were the colonizers? Who was moving around the world colonizing different countries? It was the Europeans who were doing that. Why do you think, and think about this for a second, there's a reason why countries in Africa, certain countries in Africa, you'll meet Africans that have a British accent. You think that just came out from the womb? No, it's because of colonialism. It was Europeans that were doing the colonizing, but Jillian doesn't want to hear that because it makes her feel uncomfortable. She wants to hear only one side. Listen,
that when you let's talk about the fact.
I mean, slavery in America was.
Do you realize that only less than 2% of white Americans owned slaves?
But it was a
pause. First of all, that's incorrect. We're going to debunk that tonight. So she's just repeating propaganda. Two, I thought it was interesting that Richie Torres is sitting there on this panel and now he wants to chime in. Now all of a sudden Richie Torres cares about what happened to black people in the United States. That's really interesting because he spent most of his time as a politician being a cheerleader for Israel and caring less about his district, his people in the Bronx. Richie Torres is from the poorest district in New York. And from what I understand, also maybe the poorest district in the country. But you don't really hear him talk about that. You never really hear him talk about the needs of the people in his district, but you hear him coming out there to support Israel, though. The number of conferences, the number of speeches that this man has spoke at for Israel. Now, all of a sudden, Richie Torres supposedly cares about slavery in this country. He wasn't talking about that before. So I don't know if this is some type of effort for Richie Torres to rebrand himself, because he's starting to notice even people in his district are turning against him because of his support for Israel. I don't know what's happening here, but I'm not falling for it. Out of all the things that Jillian Michaels could have said, she releases this statement. You know, only 2% of white people own slaves. You know what that sounds like, ladies and gentlemen? It sounds like Jillian Michaels is trying to defend slavery. It sounds like she's trying to make herself feel better about it. Because if you sit there and you tell yourself, well, it was only this percentage, that makes you kind of wash your hands so you don't have to feel any shame or any type of guilt. That's what she's doing. Of all the things she could have said, she could have just ended it with, well, I don't think that he's trying to whitewash slavery. But no. She had to take that extra step and add that part in. Then she went on to say this.
System of white supremacy.
You realize that
African-Americans
slavery is
were
thousands
slaves
of
and
years old?
White people were
Do you know
the slave
who
owners.
In
was
American-
the first race
I
to
didn't
try
realize
to
this was
end
controversial.
slavery?
Wait a second.
Okay.
Well,
I'm
what's
sorry, Jillian,
controversial
I'm very
is
Because slavery is thousands of years old and because other people own slaves, Jillian Michaels does not think that we should talk about what happened to slaves in this country in the context that it's been spoken in. She doesn't think that you should do that because it happened in other places. Chattel slavery happened here. Do people not understand that? The transatlantic slave trade was the only time that it was based solely on race. But she don't want to say that. She don't want to go there, you know? So whether you're conservative or what, I don't give a damn what the hell Jillian is today. At some point, you got to have common sense. And I don't know, it's probably not the best thing to say. When you're talking about slavery, to throw that out there. Well, you know, only 2% of white Americans own slaves, but they benefited from it. That was 400 years of free labor. And all of them benefited from it. Slaves didn't benefit from it. They weren't even considered people. They were property. And slaves were passed down generations. So if your dad had a slave, that slave will be passed down to his son or to his daughter. Let's keep it real, Jillian, because it sounds like to me, she said Donald Trump doesn't want to whitewash slavery, but it sounds like Jillian might want to whitewash slavery. Some of the things that happened during that time, we can't even get into on this show. That's how graphic and disturbing it is. So to just sit here and say it was 1,000 years ago, you know, a lot of things happened a long time ago, but it still gets talked about. I don't see Jillian Michaels. I don't see all these other people, and I don't know where Scott Jennings is, but I don't see all these other people come up here and say, oh, no. Let's not focus on Israel. Let's not focus on anti-Semitism because what happened to them happened a long time ago. You don't hear them say that. Slavery was a stain on this country and is still a stain on this country. And this country did not make any form of repair, but they made repair for other groups. Let's go on. I have so much to say.
This is an extraordinary exercise in historical revisionism.
I'm really surprised.
Do you realize that
Jillian, I'm surprised that you're trying to litigate who was the beneficiary of slavery and
I'm
who
not.
was not.
What I'm trying to tell you is
in
that
the context of American history.
Okay.
In the context of American history, what are you saying is incorrect by
I'm
saying that
you
it was white
cannot-
people oppressing black
every
people?
single thing is like, oh, no, this is all because white people bad.
Don't you do the same thing with Israel, Jillian? Jillian Michaels, don't you do the same thing with Israel? Oh, it's all, oh my God, all this stuff is happening because it's only because of Hamas. It's only because of, no. You know, we are dealing with this type of oppression and there's an increase of anti-Semitism and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. She don't want to talk about it from the other perspective. She don't want to get into the nitty gritty of it because it would implicate you know who. Everybody talks about they came over here. Slaves were brought over here. People don't get into who built those ships. But I don't think everybody's ready for that conversation. Jillian sure isn't ready for that conversation. So this is to make her feel better. And the nerve and the gall of her to say it on a Black woman show. She's saying this on Abby Phillips' show to her face.
And that's just not the truth. Like, for example, every single exhibit, I have a list of every single one. Like, people migrated from Cuba because white people bad. Not because of Castro. Yes, no, it's in there. That's what I'm saying. You don't actually know what's in there. Do you know that when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the gay flag?
Then she gets into Cuba. This is just bad. This is just bad all around, right? So let me show you a little bit here because I think, you know, we need to get into the nitty gritty. Here's what they don't want you to know. And even Dropside News, they got into this. The only 2% of white Americans own slave line is misleading. It counts the entire white population, including women and children, not households. You see this? You see how Jillian just repeats rhetoric? About 8% of all white Americans lived in a slave-owning household in 1860. 25% to 30% of white households in the South owned slaves. In parts of the Deep South, the rate is even higher. And I'm going to show you the video of this so you can see this for yourself. Slave ownership was concentrated among wealthy whites, but the entire white social order benefited politically, economically, and socially. And this is the part that Jillian also doesn't want to say. This is, again, what they don't want you to know. They benefited from it. When you have free labor, you benefit from it. Could you imagine? You have people picking your cotton, cooking your food, bathing and clothing and caring for your children, and you paid them nothing. Growing rice. See, these are the things, again, you got to remember, I lived down south. There's a reason why Charleston, South Carolina has amazing rice. Who do you think that came from? Who do you think did all those tobacco and cotton fields in North Carolina? That was free labor. And this is also a part of capitalism. We talk about exploitation today, but slavery was the greatest form of exploitation and the deepest, darkest stain on this country. I don't give a damn how long ago it happened, because you can talk about every other thing that happened a long time ago, but for some reason, when you bring up that one, it's a problem. Oh no, we're making people feel uncomfortable. It goes on to say, P.S. Jillian Michaels, after slavery ended, white supremacy continued, was enforced through Jim Crow laws, lynchings, disenfranchisement, and segregation. So the system of racial oppression continued well into the 20th century. That also includes redlining, urban renewal, which was supposed to be a solution to redlining, which also was a failure. The war on drugs. The list goes on and on. Mass incarceration, private prisons, that whole complex. But Jillian don't want to get into all of that, right? And then this is another way that white people benefited. There was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act literally required whites to capture runaway slaves even in free states. Thank you, Rana. She was responding to Jillian there. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Check this out. This new law forcibly compelled citizens to assist in the capture of runaways. It also denied enslaved people the right to a jury trial and increased the penalty for interfering with the rendition process. But Jillian don't want to get into that, right? And what made it worse is she doubled down. I'm denigrating all of humanity by pointing out that 98% of American white people in 1860 didn't perpetuate slavery. And in fact, many white Americans died to end it. It wasn't many. Let's flash back. It wasn't many. Because while some of them may not have owned slaves, they had no problem catching them. And they still benefited economically from a system of free labor. They benefited from it. This is the worst part about it. She doubled down. Now, let me show you something, okay? Since Jillian don't really want to go there. We're not done with you. We're not done with you, Jillian. Watch this video because this guy breaks this down so well. Big face Jillian Michaels he called her Big Face. Big face Jillian Michaels is a perfect example why history needs to be taught. Watch this.
So anyone surfing social media this week has surely seen this clip of Jillian Michaels saying this about slavery.
Do you realize that only less than 2% of white Americans own slaves?
And while she didn't name a specific year in her claim on CNN, she did tweet this out later saying, "I'm denigrating all of humanity by pointing out that 98% of American white people in 1860 didn't perpetrate slavery." But let's take a look at this claim. Because yes, as the data shows, in 1860, there were 393,975 slave owners in the United States out of a total population of 31,183,582, or just 1.26% of the population. But let's take a closer look at that, because by taking a look at this map from 1860 of the percent of households that owned slaves at the time, we can see that slavery was no longer practiced in the North and was only practiced down here in the South. And so, yeah, if we eliminate those 18 free states and only concentrate on the remaining 15 slave states, you can see we get that same amount of slave owners that now have a population of just 12 million. That's almost 19 million off of the original number, which gets us to 3.22% of the population owning slaves. And so, yeah, if we eliminate those 18 free states and only concentrate on the remaining 15 slave states, you can see we get that same amount of slave owners that now have a population of just 12 million. That's almost 19 million off of the original number, which gets us to 3.22% of the population owning slaves. But here's another problem. If we just look at the U.S. slave states in 1860, we can see that in the slave column here, we have almost 4 million slaves. And because they can't own themselves, we got to minus them out too. And so if we remove them, we get 8.2 million with the same amount of slave owners. And now that number jumps up to 4.75% of the free population of these 15 states. But if we focus on just those 11 states that decided to secede from the United States in order to protect slavery, that percentage gets even bigger. So if we add up just the Confederate states, we get 316,632 slave owners and 5,582,222 people, meaning that now 5.67% of the free population own slaves. But again, this 5.67.
Notice that the percentage continues to increase. This is the part that Jillian doesn't get into.
Number only deals with the patriarch of a family who actually owns those slaves, not the wife and children who stood to inherit them when he died. So if we take a look at that number, we can see that 30.8% of the free families in the Confederacy owned slaves, and that number was as high as 49% in a state like Mississippi. And that's why, Jillian, it's important to teach slavery to our school children, to know how it started, how it progressed, and what states decided to fight a war to keep it. I mean, there is zero evidence to say if these 11 states had beaten the North in the Civil War that they would have ever ended slavery. It was an economic advantage that they didn't want to let go of. And that's why it's no secret that when you take a look at the map of people that owned slaves in 1860 and compare it to the map of the states that decided to fight a war over slavery, and then compare it to a map of the violence that was brought against black people in the 10 years after Jim Crow laws were adopted in the South, and then compare it to a map of the segregation that existed all the way into the 1950s and the 1960s, it's clear that the same culture that was committed to slave ownership decades after other American states gave it up maintained that culture in those same states more than a century later. This is a picture from 1965 of a woman and her daughters. And that's why it's important to teach all history, Jillian, not just cherry pick certain percentages when they work for your argument. We need need to teach kids everything and let them figure it out for themselves.
That's right. That's the part I think that's important for people to hear. And by the way, we talk about the southern states, but the North, your hands aren't clean either. And I had talked about this a while back on the show because a lot of people don't know this. When we talk about the ports that a lot of the slaves were brought to, guess what was one of the top 3 ports? Rhode Island. What was their product? Rum. You know, it's one of those things that Rhode Island didn't really, they don't like that to kind of get out there. But a couple years ago, they came to a reckoning about it and made a public apology, etc. But for a long time, that was one of those things that did not get out. And then one day it finally did. Charleston, South Carolina was one of the biggest ones. One of the biggest ones, right? So the math that Jillian explained on that panel, it's missing some context. Also keep in mind, those are the people that were recorded. So the point that he made there, especially when you're talking about slaves that have been passed down by generation, passed down from the parent to the kid, and then from that kid to their kid. People have to remember, again, like I said, they weren't considered people. Slaves were considered property. But I got some questions because, see, this is coming out now, and no shade to her child, but people are looking at you some kind of way, Jillian. It's in this very moment, Abby Phillips should have asked Jillian Michaels, how will she explain American slavery to her daughter? So you see, this is why, and I said this before, just because you have a black child, that don't mean nothing to me. That don't mean nothing to me. Now, her daughter, from what I understand, is from Haiti. Guess who had a slave rebellion? Haiti. What would Jillian Michaels, are you seriously going to sit up there and tell your child, well, only 2% of white Americans don't? Seriously? I worry about this. I worry about this. Now, she don't want you to talk about it. Now, I want to bring up an example. When we look at the Japanese internment camps, because people need to see this, right? And people say, well, that wasn't as long ago. And da, da, da. People aren't talking about the things that are continuing to happen to the Black community today. Like all those things that he mentioned in that video. When we talk about everything that happened after slavery, okay, the slaves are freed. Then people didn't want to hire them for jobs. Then they had to, work within the community to try to find their own way. Building Black Wall Streets, white people coming and burning them down every time. Seneca Village, it's not just Tulsa. That's the more popular one. There were Black Wall Streets in North Carolina. But to see even the history of a group of Black people that moved to what they called Seneca Village at that point in time, built their own homes, started having their own schools. And then the city, they come in and they say, we're taking the land and we're turning this into a park. That still happens today. Jillian don't want to hear about that. This is something, is one of the reasons why I started filming this documentary. Because people need to see that what happened in the past, a lot of these things are still happening today, but they're done in a different way. Whether it's eminent domain or any other reason that these cities come up with. Because you see, it's only when it's Black people, when it comes to the Japanese Americans that were part of the internment camps. I just want to give you a flashback, okay? Japanese internment camps were the sites of the forced relocation and incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry in the Western United States during the Second World War and established in direct response to the Pearl Harbor attack. Let's fast forward to FDR, who so many people like to praise. On February 19th, 1942, FDR signed an executive order 9066. Under the terms of the order, Some 120,000 people of Japanese descent living in the US were removed from their homes and placed in Japanese internment camps. The US justified its action of these Japanese internment camps by claiming that there was a danger of those Japanese descent spying for the Japanese. Yeah, we all know about these dangers they talk about, right? However, more than 2/3 of those interned were American citizens. Half of them were children. None had ever shown disloyalty to the nation. The Japanese internment camps. This lasted from 1942 to 1945. Under Ronald Reagan, there was repair that was implemented to the Japanese Americans that were a part of those internment camps, as it should have been. Not only was there repair, but there was cash reparations for them and for their descendants. This lasted from 1942 to 1945. Slavery was over 400 years. I bring this up to prove a point. We have done repair for other groups before. We continue to do repair right now. We had the story about Columbia University implementing cash payments, announcing that as of recently for Zionists at the university that said their feelings were hurt because of the pro-Palestinian protests. So as I have said before, it is one particular group that causes people to lose their crap. It is when you start to demand repair for Black Americans, that's when people lose it. Jillian Michaels, I don't know what the hell was going through her mind at that point in time. You know, I don't know what in the world she was thinking that made her think that was the right thing to say. I don't know. And to make things worse, she decided to double down. And she has a Black child. I know Abby Phillips has that show, and I know she probably want to keep her job, but I don't think I would have been able to keep my cool with Jillian after she said what she said. And her words, her saying that, first of all, her numbers were wrong, but her saying that was basically a way to kind of brush it off your shoulder. Because if you can convince people that it was only a small piece, a small, just tiny little fraction that we're doing this, then maybe they can shrug their shoulders about it. And for Jillian to omit that white people benefited from it, whether they own slaves or not, is also disingenuous. 400 years. And there's one more point I want to add. For those who did not, and yes, there were some abolitionists that were white Americans. And she said many, wasn't many, but there were some that were abolitionists that said no. What about all the people that said nothing? What about all the people that said nothing when families were ripped apart? When children were taken from their mother and their father and sold like property? Where were all those people? Where was the outrage? Where were the voices? Where was the outrage when they would take a baby that was just born from the mother and sell it? Where was the outrage? So if your feelings are hurt, if you're bothered, ask yourself why you so damn bothered. Why does Jillian seem so bothered? Well, actually, we can't blame everything on, no, we blame it on colonialism. We can blame colonialism, because if it is not for colonialism, these countries are left alone. They grow and they thrive on their own. And you don't have European countries going to the islands, going to countries in Africa, colonizing them, trying to remove their culture. You don't have that. She just wants to wash her hands of it. That was very problematic statement that she made there. And you know what? It's really interesting. The people who really trying to just make money, some of the, oh, I'm just going to agree. I'm conservative and I'm just going to agree with the conservative side because that's going to make me coins or whatever. Some of the black ones that I saw on YouTube saying, well, you know, da 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 da. I tell you, people will sell out for $1. It's a damn shame. But I'm not one of them. You are not going to get that from me, period. Didn't even have her numbers right. Again, I don't know what the hell she was thinking, but that was not good for Jillian. Not good at all. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.